It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet little town, tucked away between rolling hills and a bustling highway, the kind of place where time seemed to stretch, moving slower than the fast-paced world outside. To most, it was just another small town, a forgotten corner of the world that never made headlines. But for Alexander Hayes, one of the wealthiest men in the country, it was just a pit stop on his way to finalize another business deal. He'd arrived in town with little thought, his mind occupied with the numbers and figures of yet another land transaction. Alexander wasn't the kind of man who took the time to appreciate the small things. His life was built on controlling the uncontrollable, his company, his wealth, his reputation. But as he stood near the fountain in the town square, glancing over notes on his phone, something caught him off guard. A small tug at his sleeve. He glanced down to find a little girl, no older than 7, staring up at him. Her eyes were wide with curiosity, filled with a kind of innocence only children seem to possess. Alexander's eyebrows furrowed. Not used to being interrupted in such a casual manner, he could tell right away she wasn't intimidated by him. Not at all. She wore a bright smile, her 2 missing front teeth adding a charm to her youthful features. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft but confident. Startled, Alexander looked down, not sure what to expect. "Yes," he replied, trying to sound polite, though his voice came out more formal than intended. The little girl didn't seem to mind. Instead, her smile grew even wider as she pointed at his wrist. The dark, oddly shaped birthmark there. It had been a part of him since birth, a mark he'd long stopped noticing. It was his, but something about the way she pointed at it felt different. "My grandma has a birthmark just like yours," she said, matter-of-factly, still smiling up at him. Chill ran down Alexander's spine. The world seemed to slow around him as his mind raced. No one had ever pointed out his birthmark before, let alone mentioned it in such an offhand way. But what unsettled him even more was the casual mention of her grandmother having the exact same mark. Was it possible? What was the connection? For a moment, he stood frozen, his thoughts swirling. He had always known he was adopted, but he'd never cared to dig deeper into his past. He told himself it didn't matter. His life had been good enough without the need for family history. Yet here was this little girl, speaking as if she knew something he didn't, pulling him toward a past he'd long buried. "Your grandmother?" he asked, his voice softer now, his curiosity getting the better of him. "She has one like this?" The girl nodded enthusiastically. "Yep, right here," she said, pointing to the same spot on her own wrist. Alexander was stunned. He lifted his wrist slightly, his gaze shifting from his birthmark to the little girl's face. Something about her reminded him of a feeling he couldn't quite place. Something familiar, yet completely foreign. She looked at him with innocent eyes, completely unaware of the storm of questions brewing inside him. A strange thought flickered through his mind. He had spent his entire life in the fast-moving world of business, negotiating deals, building his empire. He had no time for uncertainty or nostalgia. But now, this chance encounter with a child was pulling him into a world of questions he had long avoided. "What's your name?" he asked, kneeling down to her level, his voice more serious than before. "Emma," she replied, pride shining through in her voice. "Emma," he repeated, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "Where's your grandmother?" She pointed across the square, her small finger guiding his gaze to an older woman sitting on a park bench, feeding pigeons. The woman had grey hair, tied back in a low bun, and a gentle smile that seemed to radiate warmth. There was something about her that seemed familiar to Alexander, though he couldn't explain why. His heart began to race. He wasn't sure what had come over him, but something deep inside him urged him to walk over to her. Logic screamed at him to ignore the impulse, to brush it off and go back to his business. But there was something undeniable tugging at him, something he couldn't resist. "Do you think I could meet her?" he asked, almost surprising himself with the request. Emma beamed and grabbed his hand. "Sure, come on," she said eagerly, pulling him toward the bench. As they walked, Alexander felt a strange sense of anticipation building inside him. His mind raced, wondering why he was so affected by this encounter. What was it about this town, this moment, that had stirred something within him? When they reached the bench, Emma ran ahead, her voice high-pitched and excited. "Grandma, this is Alexander. He has a mark just like yours." The older woman, Margaret, looked up at the sound of her granddaughter's voice. Her eyes locked onto Alexander's, and in that instant, he felt like the world had shifted beneath his feet. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, something unspoken, something deep. Margaret stood slowly, her expression a mix of shock, disbelief, and something else that Alexander couldn't quite identify. She glanced at his wrist, then back up at his face. As if trying to connect the dots of a memory long buried, Alexander felt his heart race. He stood frozen, unable to move or speak, as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unasked questions. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It can't be." The words hung in the air, and Alexander's mind went blank. The world around him seemed to fall away, as his thoughts scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Could it be possible? Was this woman really? Emma tugged at her grandmother's sleeve, oblivious to the tension in the air. "See, Grandma, just like yours." Margaret blinked quickly, as if trying to clear the fog in her mind. She forced a small smile and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I see." But Alexander could sense the undercurrent of emotion in Margaret's voice. Something deeper than simple recognition. He glanced at her wrist once more, then back at her eyes, and suddenly everything felt like it was falling into place, though he didn't know how. He was overwhelmed, unsure whether this was a moment of chance or something far more significant. "I'm sorry," he said, trying to regain his composure. "I didn't mean to intrude, but when Emma mentioned it, I couldn't help but—" "No need to apologize," Margaret interrupted gently, but there was a firmness to her voice. "It's just, well, it's not something you see every day." Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling in his chest. He had no idea what to make of it, but deep down, he knew that his life was about to take a turn he never could have predicted. And with that, everything changed. Alexander stood there, staring at Margaret, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The look in her eyes was unsettling, a mix of confusion and something deeper, something he couldn't quite pinpoint. He had dealt with business deals that made him question everything he thought he knew about the world. But this was different. This felt personal, like the universe was showing him something he had been blind to for years. As the moments passed, the quiet tension between them grew. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her eyes flickering toward the ground before meeting his gaze again. "You really don't remember, do you?" she asked softly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. Her voice cracked slightly, a sign of the weight she carried. And for the first time, Alexander saw a side of her that was more than just a grandmother sitting on a park bench. "Remember what?" he asked, his voice strained. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, but he could feel his pulse quicken, as if his body was preparing for something. Margaret hesitated, then turned her attention to Emma, who had now skipped off to play with some children nearby, leaving them alone in the stillness of the afternoon. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached up to touch the birthmark on her own wrist. It's been so many years. I never thought I'd see anyone else with it. Not like this. Not like you. Alexander's mind was spinning. There were too many questions, too many possibilities. Who are you really? He asked, his voice sharp now, as the unease in his chest started to transform into a feeling of urgency. What is this all about? Margaret glanced over her shoulder at Emma, making sure the little girl was still out of earshot. Her face softened as she took a deep breath, as if gathering the strength to speak a truth she had kept hidden for far too long. You don't remember me, do you? You don't remember your past. The words hit him like a punch. Alexander staggered backward, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced to make sense of her statement. Of course, he didn't remember. He had been adopted, raised by a wealthy couple who had always kept the details of his past locked away. But this was different. Your real name, Margaret continued, her voice growing heavier with each word, was Liam Hayes. You were my son. For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. His head swam, his world spinning faster than he could grasp. His heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he could barely hear her words, but they echoed in his mind over and over again. You were my son. The world had suddenly become a place filled with holes and gaps, pieces of a puzzle that made no sense. He had always known he was adopted, but to hear it spoken like this, so matter-of-fact, so absolute, shook him to his core. No, he whispered, shaking his head. That's impossible. I don't remember anything like that. His voice was laced with disbelief, a desperate attempt to reject what she was saying. You're wrong. Margaret's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the sorrow in her eyes. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. I didn't want to tell you this. I didn't want to open these wounds again, but I can see it now. I can see the mark. It's the same. You're my son. You disappeared when you were just a baby. They told me you died in a fire, that the building burned to the ground, that there was no trace of you left. She paused, swallowing hard. But they lied to me. You weren't dead. You were taken. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. His mind was reeling, trying to make sense of her words. The fire, the tragedy that had shaped his entire life, the idea that the people who had raised him, the ones he had trusted most, could have lied to him for all these years, was too much to comprehend. It was a betrayal on a scale he couldn't have imagined. But there was something else, something nagging at him, something about Margaret's face that made him pause. She wasn't speaking with the emotion of someone who had just learned this information. She spoke as though she had known the truth all along, as though she had been waiting for this moment. You were taken? He asked, his voice trembling. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes. It wasn't just an accident, Liam. They wanted you. You're part of something much bigger than all of us. She looked around, making sure no one was listening. There are people out there who would do anything to keep the truth hidden. People who control everything, even the lives of children like you. I tried to find you, but they made sure I couldn't. And then I had to live with the idea that I would never see you again, that I would never know what happened to my own child. Alexander felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the earth itself was crumbling. The pain in Margaret's voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his own loss. The life he thought he knew, the perfect, controlled, wealthy existence, had been built on a lie. What do you mean they? He asked, his voice hoarse. but desperate. Who took me? Who are these people? Margaret's face darkened. I don't know. I never knew. But I've spent my whole life looking, trying to find you. And I've never stopped believing that one day you'd remember, or that the truth would come out. You've always had that mark, Liam. It's not just a coincidence. The name Liam hung in the air, like a distant memory rising to the surface of his consciousness. But it was quickly drowned out by another thought that hit him. Why would they hide the truth from him? And then it all clicked. He had spent his life thinking he was someone else, someone chosen, someone special. But what if everything he had believed about himself was wrong? Where do we go from here? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Margaret's face tightened. We need to find out who's been hiding the truth. And you need to remember who you are, Liam. There are people who will stop at nothing to keep you in the dark. People who have been watching you for years. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. He wasn't just a businessman, a billionaire, a man of wealth and power. He was a pawn in a game far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And now it seemed the game had come to find him. Margaret leaned in closer, her voice urgent. You have to be careful. They'll come for you. Suddenly, Alexander felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Someone was watching them. Someone was listening, and that someone wouldn't stop until they had everything under control. But what was everything? What had he been a part of all these years without even knowing? The answers were out there, and they were waiting. The atmosphere around them seemed to thicken, the air growing heavier with every passing moment. Alexander's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest, as he tried to process everything Margaret had just said. They'll come for you. They'll stop at nothing. The weight of those words hung over him, making him feel like a target. It was no longer just about his identity. It was about survival, about understanding why his life had been built on a foundation of secrets and lies. Margaret's face was pale, her hands shaking, but her eyes were steady, determined. We need to move now, she whispered urgently, her voice barely above a breath. There's no time to waste. She glanced around the park again, as though the shadows themselves were conspiring against them. The people who took you, they're closer than you think. For the first time, Alexander felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He wasn't just some billionaire businessman. He was a person caught in a vast conspiracy, and the more he learned, the less control he had. His whole life had been a carefully constructed illusion, and now that the truth was starting to unravel, there was no turning back. Where do we go? He asked, his voice tinged with a panic he could no longer hide. Margaret looked at him with a sad smile. I've always known I'd find you one day. But this, I didn't know it would be like this. They've been keeping tabs on you ever since you were adopted. Your name wasn't just changed for fun. It was part of their plan, part of something much bigger. You were supposed to stay in the dark. Who are they? Alexander demanded, his patience slipping away. The urgency in his voice was undeniable now. Why can't you just tell me who they are? Margaret hesitated for a moment before answering. They're a group of powerful people who control everything from behind the scenes. They're the ones who decide who gets power, who gets wealth, who lives and who doesn't. They used to be government officials, businessmen and criminals. But over the years they've merged into one. They go by different names, but they are always the same, always watching, always waiting for the right moment to strike. Alexander felt a chill sweep over him. The more she spoke, the more he realized how trapped he had been, how every move he made had been influenced by forces far beyond his control. All those years of success, of wealth, of influence, had been nothing but a smokescreen. Before he could say another word, he felt a shift in the air, A movement in the distance. He turned instinctively and caught sight of a sleek black car pulling up to the curb. His heart skipped a beat. It was too close, too precise. "They're here," Margaret whispered, her voice laced with panic. "We need to go now." Alexander barely had time to think. He grabbed Margaret by the arm, pulling her away from the park bench and toward a narrow alley that led into the city streets. His breath came fast and shallow as his mind raced for a plan. They couldn't let themselves be caught. They couldn't let these people win. But just as they turned the corner, a voice called out, smooth and calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority. "Liam! Margaret!" They both froze. Alexander's blood ran cold. The voice belonged to someone familiar, someone he thought he'd never hear again. Standing there, just a few feet away, was the man who had raised him, who had always been there. Richard Hayes, the very man he had called father for as long as he could remember. "Don't do this," Richard said, his tone both pleading and commanding. "You don't know what you're getting into." Alexander's mind screamed in disbelief. You're part of this." The question was almost too much to say out loud, but it spilled from his lips anyway. The world around him seemed to blur, and for a second, he couldn't even see the man who had raised him. All he saw was the figure that had controlled everything, that had orchestrated the lie from the very beginning. "I never wanted this life for you, Liam," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's too late. You can't undo what's been done. We've protected you for years, but you can't run from this anymore." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes as she stepped forward. "You've been lying to him this whole time, Richard. How could you?" Richard raised his hand, stopping her. "I did it to keep him safe. You have to understand. There's no other way. They'll come for him, and they'll destroy everything. His birthmark. It's not just a mark. It's a symbol, a signal that he's the one they've been waiting for." The words were a punch to Alexander's gut. He had always felt different, but he never imagined it was because of something so fundamental, a birthmark. A simple mark that connected him to a past he never knew, to a life that had been ripped away from him. But now, in this moment, standing face to face with the people who had shaped his reality, he felt something shift. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was clarity. "I don't care what they want," Alexander said, his voice steady, though his heart was still racing. "I'm not going back. I'm done being their pawn." Richard's face twisted in agony. "You don't know what you're saying. You have no idea what you'll be up against." But Margaret's voice cut through the tension. "Let him go, Richard. He has to make his own choices now. And maybe, just maybe, he'll finally get to live the life he was meant to have." For the first time, Alexander felt free. He was no longer bound by the lies, no longer controlled by the forces that had manipulated him for so long. He had a choice now, a choice to reclaim his life, to break free from the shadows that had hung over him since birth. And with that choice, the weight of the past began to lift. The lies, the manipulation, the secrets, they were no longer his burden to carry. As Richard turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, Alexander stood there with Margaret, looking out over the city. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. The truth was his to discover now. And no matter what came next, he would face it head on, with the night stretching out before them. Alexander knew this was just the beginning. The world was full of unknowns, full of people who would stop at nothing to maintain control. But he was no longer afraid, because the truth had finally set him free.